Complete silence greeted Sterling Maddox as he awakened. This wasn't tranquil quiet, but rather the eerie stillness that precedes mortality. Beyond his cabin's window, a century of fighters remained frozen in flawless alignment, their countenances adorned with ceremonial paint rather than war markings. Like phantoms, they had materialized in the pre-sunrise gloom, encircling his homestead, without producing even the faintest noise. Sterling's weathered fingers avoided reaching toward his firearm. His wisdom ran deeper than such impulses. Their purpose wasn't his demise. They had come seeking something infinitely more complex. The elderly gentleman lifted himself from his sleeping place, his bones aching from countless years of demanding existence and even more demanding decisions. For 23 years, he had anticipated this moment's arrival. The sheer magnitude of their numbers and the formality of their presence had never entered his imagination. Through the fractured window pane, the commander became visible, a female whose ebony locks bore silver threads, her gaze locked upon his entrance. Something rested within her grasp, an object that constricted Sterling's chest with recollections he had interred more profoundly than any burial site. Dawn's rays peeked over the distant horizon, painting elongated shadows throughout the dusty courtyard. Yet not a single warrior stirred. Not one mount shifted position. Time appeared suspended, waiting to observe whatever events were destined to transpire. Sterling understood their desires. The uncertainty lay in whether he possessed the ability to fulfill them. His previous attempt to assist these people had resulted in the loss of all that held meaning. His loved ones, his reputation, his essence itself had vanished. However, as he observed the quiet assembly of fighters maintaining their watch, Sterling comprehended that certain obligations resist erasure. Some distinctions cannot be refused, and some verities. These verities merit one's life. Sterling's unshod feet contacted the frigid timber flooring as he approached the window. Every movement sent agony through his inflamed joints, yet he disregarded the discomfort. Suffering had become a familiar companion. He flattened his lined face against the glass, examining the formation beyond. The fighters had arranged themselves in a flawless circle surrounding his modest ranch dwelling. Each individual stood precisely 10 steps from their neighbor. Their steeds remained positioned in orderly lines behind them. No single creature pawed at the earth or breathed heavily. Even the natural world seemed to pause its breathing. The commander, the woman bearing silver-streaked hair, stayed positioned directly before his entrance. Sterling could observe her with clarity now. Ayana. Through all these years, she had developed into the formidable woman he had always recognized she would become. The frightened, malnourished child he had once carried to safety no longer existed, replaced by someone who demanded complete reverence. Within her hands rested a package enclosed in deer hide. Sterling recognized the contents of that bundle. His throat constricted with emotions he believed permanently extinguished. A young fighter moved slightly within the formation, disrupting the perfect stillness. Ayana rotated her head sufficiently to regard him. The gesture was subtle, yet the communication was unmistakable. The young man immediately returned to his frozen stance. Sterling pulled on his worn cowhide boots and fastened his shirt with trembling digits. 23 years he had existed in this seclusion, conversing with none, confiding in none, convinced he merited nothing superior to this vacant existence. Yet they had located him regardless. He approached his kitchen table where his coffee mug remained cold and untasted. Beside it lay the correspondence he had been composing and recomposing for months. The message he never intended to deliver. His acknowledgement of guilt, his regret, his reasoning for decisions that had destroyed everything. Beyond his walls, the sun ascended further. The fighters continued their vigil, without producing a single sound. Sterling understood this instant would determine everything that followed. He could remain indoors, deny this reality, and await their departure. Alternatively, he could confront the truth he had been avoiding since that horrific winter when everything transformed. The package in Ayana's grasp reflected the morning illumination. Sterling glimpsed the faded azure fabric visible through the deer hide covering. His daughter's garment, the one she had worn on the day of her death, the day he had chosen to preserve an entire tribe rather than rescue her. Sterling's hand shook as he extended toward the door grip, then halted. The burden of that winter day overwhelmed him like a collapsing structure. December 1851, the snowstorm that persisted 8 days, the decision that obliterated everything he had ever cherished. He recalled Ayana as she existed then, scarcely 12 years of age, her lips colored blue from cold, her small frame burning with fever. She had been his first discovery in the snow, nearly deceased beside her frozen horse. Behind her, distributed across the frozen valley, lay 47 members of her tribe. Men, women, children, all starving, all dying. Sterling had been journeying homeward to his spouse and daughter, his saddle pouches loaded with medical provisions from the settlement. Christmas remained 3 days distant. He had promised little Emma he would return in time to assist her in hanging the stockings beside the hearth. Instead, he had encountered himself facing an impossible decision. Through the window, he watched Ayana's steady respiration create small clouds of moisture in the cool morning atmosphere. She hadn't shifted from her stance in 20 minutes. None of them had. This wasn't impatience or hostility. This represented ceremony. This was respect being offered. But reverence for what? For the individual who had rescued their ancestors, or for the individual who had failed his own family during the process. Sterling approached the wooden container beside his sleeping place and raised the cover with hands that trembled more from memory than age. Inside, beneath layers of dust and remorse, rested the newspaper fragment he had preserved through all these years. The headline still caused his stomach to contract. Local rancher's family dies while he assists enemy tribe. Enemy. They had labeled Ayana's people as enemies, the same people who now stood in perfect formation around his dwelling, their weapons secured, their intentions obviously peaceful. The article portrayed him as a betrayer, an individual who had forsaken his Christian obligation to his own family. The settlement had rejected him within days. His neighbors ceased acknowledging him. His ranch workers departed. The financial institution demanded his debts. However, what the newspaper hadn't realized, what nobody had realized, was that Sterling hadn't simply stumbled upon those dying people. He had been seeking them, following their trail, because his daughter Emma wasn't merely his daughter. She was half Cheyenne, Ayana's relative. The tribe dying in that valley represented Emma's mother's people. Beyond his walls, a hawk circled above, its call piercing the morning silence. Several of the fighters looked upward, following its journey across the heavens. Yet their positions remained unaltered. Sterling closed his eyes and allowed the complete weight of that terrible winter to consume him. He had made his decision, understanding precisely what it would demand from him. Now, after more than 2 decades of banishment and disgrace, Judgment Day had finally come. Sterling compelled himself to remember those 8 days in detail, every frozen breath, every life preserved, every moment that carried him further from home and deeper into a choice he couldn't reverse. He had discovered Ayana first, barely conscious in the snow. Her fever burned so intensely she was delirious, calling for her mother in a language Sterling comprehended better than most white men. Emma's Cheyenne mother had taught him the fundamentals before she died during childbirth. Behind Ayana, he found the remainder of the band, 47 souls scattered across the valley like fallen foliage, some still breathing, some already departed. The survivors were too weak to journey, too ill to hunt, too proud to plead. Sterling had established camp right there in the open, using his own supplies to construct shelters against the relentless wind. His medical knowledge, learned from his father who had been a frontier physician, told him what each person required. Willow bark tea for the fevers, hot broths for the malnourished, warm blankets for the children whose lips had turned blue with cold. For 3 days he had labored without rest, treating wounds, feeding the weak, maintaining fires despite the howling blizzard that seemed determined to bury them all. Each life he preserved felt like a small victory against the cruel winter. But on the 4th day, the storm had intensified. The temperature dropped so low that even breathing became painful. Several of the elders were failing despite his efforts. That's when he had made the decision that would torment him forever. He had used the last of his winter coat to wrap a dying child, given his final blanket to an elderly woman whose cough was rattling her chest. shared his remaining food with nursing mothers whose milk had dried up from starvation. By the 6th day, Sterling himself was growing weak. His hands were numb with cold. His lips were cracked and bleeding, but he couldn't abandon them. These people were Emma's blood relatives, her mother's family, the grandmother who had sung lullabies in Cheyenne, the uncles who had carved toys from wood, the cousins who had played with Emma during their secret visits to the reservation. Outside his cabin window, Ayana shifted slightly. She was no longer the dying child he had cradled against his chest 23 years ago. Now she stood as a commander of 100 warriors, her presence demanding absolute respect from every man behind her. The bundle in her hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Sterling knew that inside that deerskin wrapping lay not just Emma's dress, but everything he had lost. His family, his reputation, his place in the world. But looking at Ayana now, strong, proud, alive, Sterling wondered if he had actually lost everything, or if he had simply been too broken to see what he had gained. The real question was whether he was ready to discover which truth the warriors had come to honor. On the 8th day, the blizzard finally broke. Sterling had managed to save 31 lives. 16 had been lost to the cold and starvation, but those who remained were strong enough to make the journey to the reservation, where food and proper shelter waited. Ayana had been among the survivors. Weak but alive, she looked up at Sterling with eyes that held a gratitude too deep for words. Her fever had broken on the 5th day. The willow bark tea and constant care had pulled her back from death's door. As the rescue band prepared to leave, the tribal elder had pressed something into Sterling's hands, a small carved medallion depicting a bear protecting its cubs. For the man who chose our children over comfort, the old man had whispered in broken English, "This debt will never be forgotten." Sterling had pocketed the medallion and started his journey home, exhausted but certain he had made the right choice. Emma would understand. His wife, Sarah, would be proud. They would both know why he had stayed to help their daughter's relatives. But when he had finally reached his ranch on that clear, cold morning, he had found only silence. The house was dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. His call for Emma and Sarah went unanswered. With growing dread, Sterling had pushed open the front door and stepped into a scene that would replay in his nightmares for decades. Sarah lay in their bed, her face peaceful but her skin cold as marble. The doctor would later say it had been pneumonia brought on by the same brutal cold that had nearly killed the tribe. She had fought it for days, waiting for Sterling to return with the medicine he had promised to bring back from town. But those medical supplies, the fever-reducing powders, the lung tonics, the blankets, had all been used to save Ayana's people. Emma had been in the kitchen, wrapped in every quilt they owned, her small body curled near the dying embers of the fire. She had tried to tend to her mother alone, tried to keep warm, tried to wait for her father to come home. The blue dress she had been wearing, the one she had planned to wear for Christmas morning, was now wrapped in Ayana's hands outside his door. Sterling had buried his family in the frozen ground behind the house, his heart as cold as a December earth. The town had learned the truth within days. While Sterling Maddox was playing savior to hostile Indians, his own wife and daughter had died from the very illnesses he could have prevented. Now, 23 years later, Ayana stood outside his door with that dress, leading 100 warriors in what could only be called a ceremony. But Sterling still didn't understand why. Was this judgment, forgiveness, or something else entirely? The morning sun was climbing higher, and still the warriors maintained their silent vigil. Sterling realized that whatever they wanted from him, they were prepared to wait as long as necessary to receive it. The question was whether he had the courage to give them what they had come for. Sterling's hand finally closed around the door handle. The metal was cold against his palm, but not as cold as the fear that had frozen his heart for 23 years. He pulled the door open and stepped onto his porch. The effect was immediate. Every warrior shifted slightly, their attention focusing on him with laser precision. But there was no hostility in their gaze, no weapons drawn, just 100 pairs of eyes watching with something that looked almost like reverence. Ayana stepped forward, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. She was close enough now that Sterling could see the lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her braided hair, the scars on her hands that spoke of a hard life well lived, but her posture radiated strength and authority. "Sterling Maddox," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. Her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent coloring her words. The man who gave everything. Sterling's throat was dry as dust. "Ayana, you grew up strong." A slight smile touched her lips. "Because you made sure I lived long enough to grow up." Behind her, the warriors remained motionless, but Sterling could feel their attention like heat from a fire. This wasn't a casual visit. This was something that had been planned, prepared for, perhaps rehearsed. "Why now?" Sterling asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, why come now?" Ayana raised a bundle in her hands, and Sterling could see more clearly now what lay within the deerskin wrapping. Not just Emma's dress, but other things, small items, precious things. Because, Ayana said slowly, "Yesterday I buried my father, the elder who gave you this." She reached into her shirt and pulled out an identical carved medallion. A bear protecting its cubs. With his dying breath, he made me promise that the debt would be honored, that the story would be told, that the truth would be spoken. Sterling felt his knees grow weak. The old elder was dead. The man who had witnessed Sterling's sacrifice, who had known the real story, who had understood the impossible choice between love and love. Before he died, Ayana continued, "He told me something I never knew about the night you found us in the snow, about what you whispered to him when you thought I was too sick to hear." Sterling's memory raced back to that terrible week. What had he said? What confession had slipped from his lips during those delirious days of fighting death and cold? "You told him," Ayana's voice grew softer, "that you weren't just saving strangers. You were saving your daughter's family. That Emma's mother had made you promise, before she died in childbirth, that if her people ever needed help, you would be there for them." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. He had forgotten saying that, forgotten making that promise to his beloved wife's sister as she lay dying, forgotten everything except the guilt and loss that had consumed him. "You kept a promise to a dead woman," Ayana said, "and it cost you everything you had left to give." Tears Sterling hadn't shed in decades burned his eyes. The promise. He had forgotten about the promise made to Little Dove as she lay dying, her hand pressed to his, her eyes pleading with him to watch over her people if they ever faced a kind of winter that could destroy them. "The elder told me more," Ayana continued, her voice steady but gentle. "He said that in those 8 days, you never complained, never spoke of your own family waiting at home, never mentioned that you were supposed to return with medicine. You just gave everything you had." Sterling looked down at his weathered hands. "I failed them anyway. Sarah and Emma died because I wasn't there." "No." The word came from behind Ayana, spoken by one of the younger warriors. He stepped forward slightly, his face earnest. "You saved 31 lives that winter. 31 people who lived to have children, grandchildren. My grandmother was one of them. My mother, my infant sister." More voices joined in. "My father, my uncle, my wife's grandfather." Sterling realized that every warrior standing in his yard was connected to someone he had saved that winter. This wasn't just a ceremony. This was a gathering of bloodlines, a reunion of the descendants of the 31. Ayana unwrapped the bundle completely now, revealing not just Emma's blue dress, but a collection of items that took Sterling's breath away. His old medical bag, the one he had left behind in his exhaustion, a piece of the blanket he had used to wrap the dying child, the carved wooden cup he had used to give water to the fevered. "We kept them," Ayana explained. "All these years, we kept every piece of you that remained in our camp, because the elder said someday we would need to return them. Someday we would need to complete the circle." "Complete the circle?" Sterling's voice was hoarse. "You gave us life," said the young warrior who had spoken before. "You gave us futures. You gave us the chance to become who we are today. But in doing so, you lost your own future. You have lived in exile, in shame, carrying guilt that was never yours to bear." Another warrior, an older man with grays streaking his temples, stepped forward. "The town called you traitor. They said you chose Indians over your own people. They were wrong. You chose love over convenience," Ayana said firmly. You chose honor over safety. You chose to keep a sacred promise, even when it cost you everything. Sterling looked around at the 100 faces surrounding him, young and old, men and women, all watching with expressions of deep respect. These weren't the hostile savages the newspapers had described. These were families, people who had built lives, raised children, created communities, all because he had chosen to stay in that frozen valley 23 years ago. The elder's final words, Ayana said, holding up Emma's dress, were that a man who saves children should not die forgotten and alone, that a man who keeps sacred promises deserves to know his sacrifice meant something. The morning sun climbed higher, casting Sterling's shadow long across the dusty ground. For the first time in over 2 decades, he felt something other than guilt and regret. He felt the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't failed everyone after all. Ayana stepped closer to Sterling. Emma's blue dress held reverently in her hands. This belonged to your daughter. We have cared for it as we would care for the memory of our own children. Sterling's voice caught in his throat. How did you? The elder found in the snow beside your house the day after you buried them. Ayana said gently. He said the wind had blown it from their burial clothes. He kept it, knowing that someday it would need to be returned to you properly. She extended the dress toward him, but Sterling couldn't bring himself to take it. Not yet. There's something else, Ayana continued. Something the elder made me promise to tell you about what happened after we reached the reservation that winter. Sterling waited, his heart pounding. Within a week of our arrival, 3 other bands came to us. They had heard what you did, how a white man had risked everything to save Indians he had never met. Word spread across every reservation from here to the mountains. Another warrior stepped forward, an older woman with kind eyes and callous hands. My brother was dying of the same fever in a camp 2 days' ride north. When our medicine man heard your story, he traveled to find you, but you were already gone, driven out by the town. He tracked you for months, Ayana added. Many of us did. We wanted to help you, to repay what you had given us, but you disappeared completely. Sterling remembered those early months after losing his family, the way he had moved from place to place, never staying long enough to form connections, never trusting anyone enough to tell his story. 23 years, the older woman said. 23 years we have searched for Sterling Maddox, the man who chose love over hatred, the man who proved that some white men still remember what honor means. Suddenly, Ayana raised her hand high above her head. It was a signal, as one. Every warrior in the circle raised their right hand toward the sky. The movement was sharp, precise, unmistakably ceremonial. They held the position for a long moment, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on Sterling. Then, in perfect unison, they brought their hands to their hearts. The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but full of respect, gratitude, and recognition. Sterling felt the weight of 100 hearts acknowledging his sacrifice, his loss, his choice to put others before himself. But the ceremony wasn't over. Ayana nodded toward the horizon, where Sterling could now see dust clouds approaching. Riders, dozens of them, coming from multiple directions. We sent word, she explained, to every settlement within 50 miles, to every ranch, every trading post, every town that would listen. We told them the truth about Sterling Maddox, about what really happened that winter. Sterling's eyes widened as he recognized some of the approaching riders, men from town, ranchers from neighboring spreads, people who had shunned him, who had called him traitor, who had driven him into exile. They're coming to witness the truth, Ayana said firmly. To see a man receive the honor he should have been given 23 years ago. The riders arrived in groups, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that painted the morning air. Sterling recognized faces he hadn't seen in decades. Mayor Harris from town, Tom Morrison, who had run the general store, ranch hands who had once worked his land before abandoning him. They reined in their horses at a respectful distance, forming a wide outer circle around the warriors. Sterling could see confusion, curiosity, and something that might have been shame flickering across their weathered faces. Ayana's voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. 23 years ago, This man made a choice. The newspapers called it betrayal. The town called it weakness. They were wrong. She lifted Emma's blue dress higher, and the morning sunlight caught the faded fabric. Sterling Maddox kept a sacred promise to his dying wife. He saved 31 lives in the worst blizzard this territory had ever seen. He gave his medicine, his food, his warmth, his hope. And when he returned home, he found that his sacrifice had cost him everything. A murmur ran to the crowd of townspeople. Sterling could see recognition dawning on several faces, understanding that the story they believed for over 2 decades might not have been the whole truth. But from those 31 lives, Ayana continued, came children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Every person standing in this circle today owes their existence to Sterling Maddox. The young warrior who had spoken earlier stepped forward. My grandmother lived to see me born because of this man. My children will grow up knowing his name. As will mine, said another, and mine. The declarations rippled through the circle of warriors, each voice adding weight to the truth that had been buried under decades of misunderstanding. Sterling finally stepped forward and took Emma's dress from Ayana's hands. The fabric was soft despite its age, carefully preserved. He pressed it against his chest and felt, for the first time in 23 years, that his daughter would be proud of the choice he had made. The dead is honored, Ayana said formally, her words carrying the weight of ceremony. The circle is complete. Sterling Maddox, you are no longer alone. Mayor Harris urged his horse a few steps closer, his face flushed with embarrassment. Maddox, we, the town, we never knew the whole story. You never asked, Sterling replied quietly, but without bitterness. You just believed what was easiest to believe. Tom Morrison removed his hat, his voice gruff. What can we do? How do we make this right? Sterling looked around at the 100 warriors who had traveled from across the territory to honor him, at the townspeople who had ridden out to witness the truth, at the endless skies stretching above them all. You can remember, he said simply, remember that sometimes the right choice is the hardest choice. Remember that honor doesn't always look like what you expect. Ayana nodded respectfully. Our work here is done, but the story will be told in every camp, around every fire, for generations to come. Children will learn the name Sterling Maddox. As the warriors mounted their horses and began to disperse, Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. His sacrifice had meaning. His choice had been right. The frontier would indeed remember this day, not as a morning 100 warriors surrounded a lonely ranch, but as a day a forgotten hero was finally welcome home. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where honor and sacrifice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.